How many times today has someone asked you how you are doing? Fine, good, can't complain. The words leave your mouth before the question has even finished landing in your ears. This exchange is the most repeated ritual of your entire day, and you perform it on autopilot, without a flicker of real thought passing behind your eyes. The sentence exits your lips, but never once travels through your mind. And right there, inside that reflex that lasts less than a single second, a mechanism is running that the great psychologist Carl Jung spent a lifetime trying to expose. The person who answers that question is not, in any meaningful sense, you. The one who answers is a mask, something you have been culturally trained to wear the moment another human being turns their attention toward you. Jung called this mask the persona, borrowing the Latin word for the hollow object ancient actors held up to their faces so that their voice could pass through it and echo across a crowded amphitheater. Stop for a moment and think honestly. For the last 5 years, maybe the last 15, when someone asked how you were doing, did you tell them what you actually felt, or did you tell them what was expected of you? Even when your world was quietly falling apart, even after a loss, even in the middle of a private storm, did the word fine still come out automatically? If your answer is yes, welcome to the condition shared by billions of people, lost inside their own persona without realizing it. And according to Jung, this is not a small, harmless social nicety. It is the opening move in one of the most common and most corrosive patterns in the entire architecture of human psychology. This script will not simply hand you an observation and move on. It will walk you through Jung's entire theoretical universe on this subject, from the ancient origins of the mask itself, through Nietzsche's philosophy of masks and Kierkegaard's search for authentic existence, into the collective sickness of the social media age, and finally into a concrete, usable path for recognizing the mask, loosening its grip, and returning to the person underneath it, because what is at stake here is not a minor courtesy. As Jung repeatedly warned throughout his collected works, a person who becomes completely identified with their persona eventually loses access to the authentic voice of their own soul, and that loss rarely announces itself. It creeps in first as an unexplained emptiness, then as a chronic fatigue that no amount of rest seems to fix, and eventually as a full existential crisis that arrives seemingly out of nowhere. So I'm going to ask you again. Someone asked how you were doing. What did you say? And more importantly, what were you actually feeling? Underneath the words, linguists who study everyday conversational patterns have found that the overwhelming majority of responses to "how are you" fall into a tiny handful of fixed phrases. Fine, good, not bad, can't complain. Stepping outside those scripted replies to say something that actually reflects your inner state is statistically rare, and tends to happen only inside relationships built on deep trust. That single observation, on its own, tells you how alive and how relevant Jung's theory of the persona still is today. This is the question Jung spent his entire career asking. Picture a concrete, ordinary scene from your own life. On the bus in the morning, a familiar face turns to you and asks how you are. Before the second syllable of the question has even finished, the word fine is already falling out of your mouth. That speed, that automaticity, that reflex delivered without a single conscious thought, is actually the visible tip of an extraordinarily complex psychological process. In milliseconds, your mind scans the social context, selects the appropriate script, and fires it out through your voice, the same way a piece of background software runs continuously without you ever noticing it. This question is not small or trivial. According to Jung, it is one of the most basic tests of human freedom and authenticity. Because if you cannot hear your own real voice in the simplest, most everyday exchanges of your life, what real chance do you have of hearing it when it comes to the far larger decisions, your career, your relationships? your deepest values. By the end of this script, I am making you a promise. If you stay with it to the last line, you will not simply have absorbed a piece of psychological theory. You will have gained a kind of vision that lets you see the quiet mechanism sitting underneath your own everyday speech patterns, the one that has been steering you for years. And once that particular kind of seeing switches on, it rarely switches back off. The word persona comes from Latin, and it referred specifically to the mask, worn by actors on the stage of ancient Roman theater. These masks served a very concrete acoustic purpose, allowing the actor's voice to pass through the hollow interior and project outward to the farthest corner of the amphitheater. In other words, persona in its original and most literal sense meant the thing the voice passes through, not the voice itself. When Jung carried this term into psychology, this was precisely the meaning he intended to preserve. The persona is the interface your inner life must pass through before it can reach the outside world. But that interface was never meant to be mistaken for the world within. In his collected works, specifically in 2 essays on analytical psychology, Jung describes the persona as a kind of compromise formed between the individual and society. A person senses what society expects of them and develops a mask suited to those expectations. Without this mask, ordinary social life would be functionally impossible. The seriousness a lawyer displays in a courtroom, the calm confidence a physician projects to a frightened patient, the quiet authority a teacher carries into a classroom, these are all functional, necessary, even healthy expressions of the persona. Jung never treated the persona itself as something pathological. He treated it as a required organ within the larger structure of psychic life. The danger, in his view, was never the mask's existence. The danger was a person collapsing entirely into identification with it. To understand the deeper roots of this idea, we have to travel back to ancient societies. Anthropological research shows that masks occupied a central role in tribal cultures across the world. In many regions of Africa, in Oceania, among indigenous peoples of the Americas, young initiates would put on a mask during coming-of-age rituals. And in that exact moment, they would set aside their personal identity and take on the role of a totemic power, an ancestral spirit, or a deity. These rituals dramatize a transition. The individual sets the private self aside and steps into a collective role. Jung argued that modern people repeat a quieter, more ritualized version of this exact pattern every single day. Every morning you leave the house and walk into your job. You are, in a very real sense, putting on the mask your particular tribe has handed you. The working person mask, the successful person mask, the happy person mask. So how does this mechanism actually function at the psychological level? For Jung, the human psyche draws on a shared reservoir of archetypal patterns he called the collective unconscious, and the persona is itself one of those archetypes. The persona archetype is an adaptive mechanism, evolved so that the individual could survive within a social group. From the standpoint of evolutionary biology, humans are an intensely social species, and group cohesion has always been directly tied to survival. Someone who refuses to conform to group norms, who broadcasts their raw inner world without any filter, has historically been the person pushed out, excluded, sometimes even killed. The capacity to construct a persona is, in this light, a product of social intelligence itself, a survival tool honed over an immense span of evolutionary time. But Jung issues a very sharp warning at exactly this point. Identification with the persona, mistaking the mask for the actual self, is one of the most common roots of psychological illness he encountered in his clinical work. Jung sometimes describes a closely related process as inflation, though the term is usually applied to a swelling of the ego, whereas persona identification tends to produce the opposite sensation, an inner emptying, an inner poverty. The person may appear strong, successful, and content to the outside world, while inside them a growing awareness accumulates that all of it is somehow false. Jung offers a personal anecdote to make this concrete. In his autobiography, Memories, Dreams, Reflections, he describes sensing two distinct personalities within himself during adolescence. He calls one of them personality number 1 and the other personality number 2. Personality number 1 is the ordinary, somewhat unremarkable young Carl Jung, who attends school and lives out his everyday social life. Personality number 2 feels as though it belongs to an earlier century entirely, philosophical, mystical, carrying a depth of wisdom that seemed to come from somewhere far older than his own years. Jung came to interpret this split as the tension between his own persona and the deeper layers of his authentic self. And recognizing that tension became one of the starting points for the entire theory of analytical psychology that he would go on to build. Another significant root of the persona concept can be found in Gnosticism. Gnostic texts, particularly those found among the Nag Hammadi writings, describe the human soul as descending into the world of matter and becoming wrapped in a series of coverings or veils along the way. This veil motif symbolizes the way the soul's true, divine nature becomes obscured by the illusions of the material world. Jung's extensive research into alchemy and Gnosticism led him to conclude that this covering or masking motif is a recurring archetypal theme running through the whole of human history. Alchemists spoke of the prima materia, the raw, unprocessed, original substance out of which everything else is made, carrying the same underlying idea that real value hides beneath an outer shell, and that shell must be removed before the value inside can be reached. Now, let's bring this into the present moment. When someone asks how you are and fine comes out automatically, that is this exact persona mechanism running in real time. It is not a conscious, deliberate choice. It is your social conditioning, your internalized collective norms, the autopilot function of the persona archetype itself. And according to Jung, learning to notice when that autopilot has taken over is the first step in learning to read your own unconscious mind. Because that small, unthought answer is actually a tiny psychological fingerprint, revealing how accurately, or how inaccurately, you are representing your inner world to yourself and to everyone around you. Jung's analysis of the persona in the collected works also has an important dimension involving gender roles. He observed that men are typically encouraged to develop a persona built around strength, rationality, and control over emotional display, while women are often steered toward a persona built around warmth, compliance, and self-sacrifice. These social templates can interfere with the balanced expression of what Jung called the psyche's masculine and feminine poles, the animus and the anima. A man who continually suppresses his emotions pushes his anima, his inner feminine, emotional, intuitive dimension, into shadow, and that shadow tends to return through indirect, uncontrolled channels, sudden outbursts, unexplained restlessness. A woman continually conditioned to suppress her own needs in service of others pushes her animus, her inner assertive, self-advocating dimension, into shadow, generating a comparable inner tension. This observation also suggests that the answer someone gives to how are you can vary along gendered lines. Research on conversational patterns suggests men tend to give shorter, less emotionally detailed answers, while women tend to give longer answers, though often still framed around concern for others rather than their own inner state. In both cases, the underlying mechanism is identical. Social conditioning inserts a filter in front of authentic emotional expression. Developmental psychology adds another layer here. In early childhood, the persona has not yet fully formed. A small child cries when hurt, shouts when angry, laughs when happy, with essentially no filter in between. But as that child grows, parents, teachers, and the surrounding culture send a continuous stream of messages about which emotions are acceptable to display and which are not. Boys are told not to cry, not to show fear. Girls are told not to show anger, with countless cultural variations on the theme. This socialization process is, in effect, the construction of the persona, and it is necessary because an unfiltered adult could not function within society. The danger Jung points to is this construction process never stopping. The child growing into an adult, completely cut off from their own emotional range, living entirely through socially approved masks. Alfred Adler, a contemporary of Jung's, described a related phenomenon using different language. For Adler, a person develops a lifestyle, a strategy for living, specifically to compensate for the inferiority complex formed in childhood. And this strategy is usually built around a projected image, a persona presented to the world. Adler's emphasis differs somewhat from Jung's, but both converge on the same basic observation. Human beings present a strong, capable, and control image to the outside world, specifically to conceal an inner fragility. Another important dimension of the persona is the simple fact that a person carries more than one across different domains of life. Jung notes that a person needs different personas for different life contexts. Your persona at work differs from your persona with family. Your persona among friends differs from your persona among strangers. This is not pathological in itself. It can even indicate a healthy psychological flexibility. The real problem arises when a person moves between these personas without any stable, unchanging core remaining beneath them, when their entire sense of identity becomes dependent on the role currently being performed. In such cases, moving from one role to another can feel almost like becoming an entirely different person. And over time, this can generate a profound identity confusion. A comparable idea appears in ancient Chinese philosophy. Confucius's concept of Li, the social rituals and codes of proper conduct, functions in some ways as an Eastern philosophical counterpart to the persona. Confucius argued that these rituals were necessary for social harmony, but insisted that beneath them the individual must preserve Ren, true humaneness, genuine warmth toward others. One of the oldest philosophical systems in the world had already identified, thousands of years before Jung gave it a clinical vocabulary, this exact tension between form and substance. The mask tradition also left a rich imprint on European history. During the medieval and Renaissance periods, a Venice carnival allowed people to dissolve the boundaries of social class and identity, stepping entirely outside their everyday persona and living, briefly, as someone else. This reveals an interesting dual function of the mask. It conceals, but it can also liberate. When people put the mask on, they were freed from the weight of their everyday social roles and could surface desires and behaviors they would normally never express. This connects directly to Jung's concept of the shadow. Since the carnival mask allowed suppressed, ordinarily unacceptable, content to rise briefly to the surface, the Italian tradition of commedia dell'arte carries a related idea. Staging fixed character masks that dramatize specific archetypal facets of human nature. The cunning of Arlecchino, the miserliness of Pantalone. Each mask embodies a particular dimension of the psyche, functioning almost as an artistic precursor to Jung's later theory of archetypes. The idea that the human psyche contains universal, recurring character patterns. Jung, in developing the persona concept, was not only concerned with social masks themselves, but with the economics of psychic energy underneath them. For Jung, the psyche possesses a finite quantity of psychic energy, what he called libido, meaning general life energy rather than anything narrowly sexual, and this energy distributes itself across the psyche's various functions. If a large share of that energy becomes devoted to constructing and maintaining the persona, the remaining psychic functions, dreaming, creativity, inner intuition, are left with insufficient fuel. This is an important consequence of Jung's model of psychic economy. Excessive investment in the persona directly impoverishes the inner world. Friedrich Nietzsche, writing before Jung, had already argued that human beings suppress their own power and will to live beneath layers of social masking. In Beyond Good and Evil, Nietzsche writes that every profound spirit needs a mask, and further, that around every profound spirit, a mask continues to grow. That line reads almost like a philosophical prophecy of Jung's later persona theory. But Nietzsche's emphasis differs. He treats the mask primarily as protection, and also as a source of isolation. The deep person knows the shallow world will not understand them, and so they wear a mask. But over time, that same mask begins to conceal their real self, even from themselves. Nietzsche's concept of the Übermensch, the overman, connects here as well. For Nietzsche, the ordinary person follows what he called herd morality, unquestioningly absorbing whatever values, norms, and behavioral patterns society hands down. This is essentially identical to what Jung calls total identification with the persona. The overman, by contrast, moves beyond herd morality to create his own values and construct his own authentic existence. Both thinkers, using entirely different vocabularies, are describing the same underlying tension: total surrender to the social mask versus individual authenticity. Martin Heidegger, one of the most influential existential philosophers of the 20th century, addresses this through his concept of Das Man, the they, or the anonymous everyone. For Heidegger, human beings routinely drift away from their own authentic existence and instead live according to Das Man, the faceless, anonymous social majority. In that condition, a person's thoughts, values, even their emotions no longer belong to them personally. They become whatever everyone thinks, whatever everyone feels. Heidegger calls this inauthentic existence. Answering "How are you?" with an automatic fine is, quite literally, speaking in the voice of Das Man, because that answer does not belong to you. It belongs to everyone, to society's collective expectation. Jean-Paul Sartre approaches the same phenomenon through his concept of bad faith. For Sartre, human beings are born into a radical freedom, and to escape the unbearable weight of that freedom, people trap themselves inside a fixed role, a fixed identity, convincing themselves they have no other option beyond that role. Sartre's famous illustration involves a waiter who becomes so completely identified with being a waiter that he forgets his own freedom, his own human potential, and moves through his job like an automaton. This is, in essence, identical to what Jung calls total identification with the persona. Expressed in a different philosophical vocabulary, Ore and Kierkegaard approaches the same territory from a more existential, more religious angle. In The Sickness Unto Death, Kierkegaard describes despair as, at its deepest root, the refusal to become oneself. For Kierkegaard, most people unconsciously avoid becoming their authentic self, because doing so is frightening, uncertain, and risky. Instead, they accept the ready-made identity, the ready-made role, the ready-made mask that society hands them, and live inside that mask comfortably, safely, but hollowed out at the core. Kierkegaard calls this the aesthetic stage of existence, a stage defined by external roles, pleasures, and social expectations. Moving out of the aesthetic stage into the ethical, and eventually the religious stage, requires the individual to fully take ownership of their own free, responsible, authentic self. The person living inside Kierkegaard's aesthetic stage can, interestingly, appear extremely successful, charming, and widely admired. Kierkegaard uses the figure of Don Juan to illustrate this stage, someone perpetually chasing new experiences and new pleasures while never truly committing to anything, or anyone, or any value. From the outside, this person appears to be someone thoroughly enjoying life. But Kierkegaard argues that underneath, a profound despair sits quietly, because this person never chooses to confront themselves and continually flees outward toward the next stimulation instead. The transition from the aesthetic to the ethical stage, for Kierkegaard, requires a leap. The individual must fully assume responsibility for their own life, must become the architect of their own choices and their own values. This is, in essence, the existential and philosophical version of what Jung calls individuation. And the first step toward that leap, in Kierkegaard's terms, is consciously recognizing one's own despair, one's own inner hollowness, which is exactly why the moment you pause before automatically saying fine, and instead notice what is actually happening inside you, may be, in Kierkegaard's language, the first spark of waking from your own aesthetic sleep. Dostoevsky treats the same theme through literature. In Notes from Underground, the unnamed narrator's inner monologues expose a consciousness boiling and raging beneath the surface of its social masks. The narrator constantly performs different roles for the outside world, but these roles pull him so far from himself that by the end he can no longer say with any confidence who he actually is. The novel stands as a literary portrait of the most extreme, most pathological form total identification with the persona can take. The sociologist Irving Goffman, working entirely independently of Jung, arrived at a strikingly similar theory. In the presentation of self in everyday life, Goffman's dramaturgical approach treats everyday life as a kind of theatrical performance. According to Goffman, every person performs continuously in daily interactions, moving between a front stage and a backstage. The front stage is what others see, the carefully managed persona you present. The backstage is what nobody sees, your real, unguarded, unfiltered self. Goffman observed that in modern society, for many people, the backstage keeps shrinking, sometimes disappearing entirely, because a culture of constant social media presence and constant connectivity demands that people remain on the front stage. Almost every waking hour, Goffman's sociological framework meshes perfectly with Jung's psychological theory of the persona, and together they reveal an important truth. The persona is not merely an individual psychological phenomenon. It is also shaped by social structures, institutions, and now technology. The answer you give when someone asks how you are is not only a product of your personal psychology, it is a product of the culture, the era, and now the digital technology you live inside. Now let's bring this philosophical framework into the clinical, into actual psychological practice. Total identification with the persona is, in Jung's clinical experience, one of the mechanisms underlying some of the most common neuroses he encountered. Jung observed a recurring symptom pattern in patients living this way: a chronic fatigue, a sense of emptiness, a feeling that life had no meaning, and most strikingly, this pattern often appeared in individuals who, from the outside, looked completely successful, well-adjusted, and Content.Jung discusses this in the 11th volume of the collected works, In Psychology and Religion, describing a middle-aged, outwardly highly successful lawyer. This man appeared, by every external social measure, to have everything: career, family, status. But by the time he came to Jung, he was living inside a deep sense of meaninglessness, a genuine existential crisis. During analysis, Jung discovered that this man had spent his entire life perfecting a persona demanded by his father and by his broader social environment, and had never once had the chance to ask himself what he actually wanted, what he actually felt, who he actually was. His persona had functioned so well that he himself had been fooled by his own mask. Jung describes another case involving a woman in her 30s. From the outside, this woman maintained the persona of a perfect wife, a perfect mother, a perfect homemaker. When she came to Jung, she was suffering from an unexplained chronic headache and a deep exhaustion. During analysis, Jung discovered that before her marriage, she had wanted to become a painter. but had abandoned that ambition under social and family pressure, and had never even admitted this abandonment to herself. Years of suppressed creative energy had, in Jung's view, converted itself into physical symptoms. The treatment Jung suggested was for this woman to begin painting again, and within a short time, her headaches and exhaustion noticeably improved. This case stands as a classic Jungian illustration of the principle that suppressed psychic energy, if denied a conscious outlet, will find a way to express itself through the body. This is the psychological foundation of what Jung called the midlife crisis. In the first half of life, a person is typically occupied with building their persona, gaining an education, establishing a career, acquiring social status, building a family. Jung considered this a necessary and generally healthy process. But in the second half of life, if a person continues to live exclusively through their persona, a reaction begins to emerge from the deeper layers of the unconscious, a return of previously suppressed content. Jung calls this compensation, the psyche's attempt to balance out whatever the conscious mind has been neglecting, through dreams, symptoms, sudden emotional eruptions, unexplained anxieties. Viktor Frankl, an existential psychiatrist and Holocaust survivor, adds an important layer here. For Frankl, the most fundamental human motivation is the search for meaning. And if a person lives their life entirely through social roles, the genuine search for meaning is suppressed. And this suppression generates what Frankl called an existential vacuum. This vacuum typically manifests as boredom, apathy, and a pervasive sense of meaninglessness. And interestingly, it appears with striking frequency in people who look, from the outside, most successful, and who have invested most heavily in their persona. R.D. Laing, the British existential psychiatrist, describes a related phenomenon with his concept of the divided self. For Laing, in severe cases, a person locks their true self away inside an inner fortress and presents only a false self, a compliant self, to the outside world. In its most extreme forms, this division can extend into schizophrenia. But Laing's crucial insight is that this division exists along a spectrum, and its milder forms overlap directly with what Jung calls identification with the persona, quietly playing out in the daily lives of millions of ordinary people. Here we need to draw an important distinction. The persona itself is not the problem. Jung repeatedly emphasizes that social life would be impossible without it. The problem is identification with the persona, and forgetting entirely the authentic self that exists beneath it. A healthy psyche uses the persona as a tool without confining itself to that tool. You can wear a professional mask at work, but you need to retain the capacity, at the end of the day, to take that mask off and sit honestly with your real feelings and your real thoughts. The problem arises when you can no longer remove the mask at all, and eventually can no longer even remember that you are wearing one. Let's go deeper now into the pathological, the genuinely sick dimension of this concept. Mythology offers a useful starting point. The Greek myth of Narcissus is typically read as a story about vanity or self-obsession, but read through a Jungian lens, it tells a different, closely related story. Narcissus falls in love with his own reflection on the surface of the water, but that reflection is not real. It is merely an image, a surface likeness. Narcissus becomes so fixated on this image that he entirely neglects his real life, his real relationships, his real self, and ultimately dissolves in front of that image. This myth is a striking metaphor for a person falling in love with their own persona, with the image they project to the world, and losing the authentic core beneath that image in the process. The legend of Faust carries a similar theme. In Goethe's Faust, the title character sells his soul for worldly success, knowledge, and power. Jung, in his extensive work on alchemy, analyzed Faust as a Faustian bargain the ego makes with its own shadow, with its own suppressed, unaccepted parts. Faust continuously builds an ever grander, ever more powerful, ever more knowledgeable persona for the outside world. But in that very process, he loses his soul, his inner life. The Epic of Gilgamesh sheds light on this theme from another angle. Gilgamesh is a great king, a powerful leader, someone with a flawless persona. But the death of his friend Enkidu forces him to confront the fragile, mortal human being hiding beneath that mask. Gilgamesh's subsequent quest for immortality is, in this reading, a reflection of the existential crisis triggered by the collapse of his persona. This epic reminds us that even the most powerful, most successful-looking people carry, underneath their persona, a deep fear and a deep fragility. The myth of Persephone can also be read within this framework. Persephone lives on the surface of the earth as an innocent, carefree young woman, until she is abducted by Hades and taken down into the underworld. Jungian interpreters generally read this descent as the involuntary, forced journey a person makes into their own unconscious, into their own shadow. Persephone undergoes a transformation in the underworld and returns as queen of both the earth above and the underworld below. This myth teaches an important lesson. Achieving genuine wholeness requires more than remaining on the sunny, socially acceptable, persona-compatible surface. At some point, a person must also descend into their own dark, unknown, frightening inner world. Without that descent, a person remains forever confined to a shallow, one-dimensional existence. Now let's move from this mythological depth to a much more concrete, much more widespread pathology of the present moment, the digital persona of the social media age. Jung never lived to see social media, yet his theory of the persona describes today's digital world with startling accuracy. Platforms built around image-sharing function, at their core, as a stage for collective persona performance. People select, crop, filter, and curate the most perfect, most successful, most joyful moments of their lives before presenting them to the world. This is the digital, hyperbolic version of the exact mechanism Jung described a century earlier. This phenomenon is not limited to individual users. It also expresses itself at the corporate and societal level. Companies build their brand identity as, in essence, a collective persona, and employees are expected to behave in alignment with that corporate persona. When an employee is continually required to reflect the company's values and the company's tone at work, a tension can emerge between their personal values and this corporate persona. Sustained over time, that tension produces the same burnout and alienation that individual persona identification produces. Only now at an organizational scale. Consider a realistic, if hypothetical, case. A professional in their 30s continuously posts images of a successful, happy, abundant life, vacations, career wins, an apparently flawless relationship. But at the end of the day, alone at home, this person experiences a gap between the image they present and the loneliness, anxiety, and dissatisfaction they actually feel. Over time, this gap between the presented persona and the felt inner reality can widen so far that the person can no longer clearly tell which one is real. This is one of the most common presentations Jungian-oriented therapists encounter today, and it is a direct, digital age descendant of the exact persona pathology Jung described 100 years ago. Research consistently shows that people who repeatedly compare their own real, imperfect, everyday lives against the idealized personas of others on social media experience significantly elevated anxiety, depression, and envy. This digital persona phenomenon has a close cousin in imposter syndrome, a distinctly modern condition. In this syndrome, no matter how successful a person appears from the outside, internally they feel like a fraud, someone perpetually anticipating the moment their real inadequacy will be exposed and their mask will fall away. From a Jungian standpoint, this syndrome makes a great deal of sense. The person has perfected their persona to such a degree that the gap between that persona and their real, uncertain, fragile inner self has become impossible for them to ignore. They know consciously that their mask is not the whole truth, but they have forgotten that something more valuable exists underneath it. Another modern case study is professional burnout. Research shows burnout does not arise purely from workload. It also arises from a person remaining, for an extended period, inside a role that conflicts with their own values and their own authentic self. A person can spend years in a role they find genuinely unfulfilling, a role socially validated and financially rewarded, but never truly aligned with who they are. The ongoing tension between this persona and the authentic self eventually exhausts psychic energy, leaving the person feeling empty, unmotivated, sometimes clinically depressed. Another striking modern case appears among young adults under intense academic and professional achievement pressure. Picture a university student expected, by family and society alike, to project an image of relentless success and ambition. This student sustains that successful persona continuously through exam results, internship applications, and social media posts. But alone at night, they may feel a deep sense of inadequacy, exhaustion, or even a longing for an entirely different kind of life. When this split persists for years, the person can drift so far from their real interests and real values that, by their 30s, they find themselves unable to answer even the most basic questions. Who am I? What do I actually want? Clinical psychologists increasingly describe this as a quarter-life crisis, and it is directly rooted in a prolonged disconnect between persona and authentic self. What are the concrete signs of this drift? First, difficulty naming your own real emotions. When asked what you feel, answering only with vague words like fine or normal. Second, a chronic sense of dissatisfaction, an inner restlessness that persists even when everything on the outside appears to be going well. Third, sudden, seemingly inexplicable emotional outbursts, a small trigger releasing a disproportionately large backlog of suppressed feeling. Fourth, physical symptoms, chronic fatigue, sleep disturbances, unexplained pain, because the body, in Jung's framework, expresses through its own language whatever the mind is suppressed. Jung calls this process somatization, psychic energy that finds no conscious outlet converting itself into bodily symptoms. Now let's turn to the solution to everything we have described so far. For Jung, the solution is never to destroy the persona. That would be both impossible and unnecessary, since the persona remains a functional tool within social life. The solution is to build a conscious relationship with the persona, to become its master rather than its servant. Jung calls this process individuation, the lifelong process by which a person integrates their conscious and unconscious dimensions into an authentic, whole, genuinely individual self. The first step in this process is awareness. Here is the first practical exercise. Starting today, at least once a day, when someone asks how you are, pause for a single second before answering. Just 1 second. And in that second, ask yourself the real question. How am I actually doing? That single second of pause is the first move in breaking the autopilot. Most of the time you will still say fine, because the social context may not allow for anything else. But in that brief internal check-in, you are, at minimum, being honest with yourself. That honesty begins to build a bridge between the answer you give outwardly and the reality you carry inwardly. The second practical step is the practice Jung recommended to his own patients and used himself: keeping a journal. This does not need to be a formal diary. It simply means spending 5 or 10 minutes writing down, without any censorship, whatever you actually felt during the day, but did not express. This practice gives suppressed emotion a conscious outlet and reduces the likelihood of that emotion converting into a bodily symptom later. The third method, and one of Jung's most original contributions, is active imagination, a technique in which the conscious ego enters into direct, controlled dialogue with the contents of the unconscious. In practice, it works like this. Sit somewhere quiet, close your eyes, and ask yourself internally, how do I actually feel right now? Then, whatever arises, an image, an emotion, a voice, observe it without judgment and without censorship. An image might appear, a tired figure, an angry child, a dark room. Try entering into dialogue with that image. Ask it questions, ask what it wants, ask what it is trying to tell you. This may feel strange at first, but Jung, across thousands of clinical cases, found this technique remarkably effective at translating the language of the unconscious into something the conscious mind can understand. The fourth step is dream analysis. Jung believed dreams represent the unconscious mind's nightly attempt to process and compensate for whatever the conscious mind suppresses during the day. If you spend your days constantly saying fine while suppressing your real feelings, your unconscious will encode those suppressed contents into your dreams at night, expressed through different symbols. As a next step, I recommend writing down whatever you remember from your dreams each morning. Over time, you will begin noticing recurring symbols, recurring themes, and these will offer direct clues about the inner reality your conscious mind has been ignoring. Jung's theory of psychological types offers another practical tool here. Jung proposed that the mind perceives the world through four basic functions: thinking, feeling, sensation, and intuition. Most people develop one or two of these functions as dominant, while relatively neglecting the others. If you are someone whose dominant function is thinking, your feeling function, your capacity to register emotional evaluation, may be relatively underdeveloped, which can make it genuinely difficult to locate what you actually feel when asked how you are. In that case, consciously practicing the habit of asking yourself not only what you think, but what you feel throughout the day helps strengthen this neglected function over time. The fifth and final step is shadow work. Jung defines the shadow as everything within ourselves that we refuse to accept, that we suppress, that we deny. Identification with the persona is, in fact, a specific form of shadow, because every feeling, thought, or desire that does not fit the persona gets pushed into shadow. One practical method for shadow work is projection awareness. Observe which traits in other people trigger an unusually strong reaction of irritation or judgment in you. According to Jung, the qualities that disturb us most in other people often reflect qualities we ourselves have suppressed, qualities living in our own shadow. If someone openly expressing their emotions makes you deeply uncomfortable, perhaps you have some unfinished business with your own suppressed emotional expression. Alongside these 5 methods, Jung placed particular emphasis on another practice: accessing the inner world through personal symbols and creative expression. At certain points in his life, Jung worked through his own inner turmoil by painting, by carving stone, even by building parts of his own house with his hands. This kind of creative, hands-on activity, one that engages intuition and feeling rather than pure analytical thought, opens a direct channel to the unconscious. You can try something similar: painting, music, gardening, even simple craftwork. What matters is engaging in the activity without worrying about whether the outcome is good or bad, and instead staying present with the process itself, with the inner experience unfolding in real time. Another important practice is finding a trustworthy relationship, whether therapeutic or personal, in which to be heard. Jung emphasized that the most fundamental requirement of the analytic process is a safe space in which a person can express their inner world without judgment and without criticism. This could be a therapist, but it could equally be a genuinely attentive friend, partner, or family member who truly listens without judging. What matters is having at least one person in your life to whom you can give a real answer to a real "how are you?" Because when the persona is constantly performing outward, the psyche never finds room to breathe. Bodily awareness practices deserve mention as well. Jung placed great importance on the connection between psyche and body, and modern somatic therapy approaches have since confirmed this connection scientifically. A chronically suppressed emotion often shows up in the body as tension, tightness, or pain in a specific area. As a simple exercise, spend 5 minutes with your eyes closed, scanning your body from head to toe, noticing where you feel tension. Once you locate that tension, try breathing directly into it and imagine it has a voice, then ask what it wants to tell you. This is essentially a bodily version of active imagination, and it is often remarkably effective at reaching suppressed material that words alone struggle to access. Silence and solitude practice also plays a critical role here. Jung describes taking regular solitary time himself, walking in nature, sitting with his own inner world with no external stimulation whatsoever. Modern life, with its culture of constant notification and constant connectivity, has made these quiet solitary moments increasingly rare. But for Jung, this kind of silence is indispensable if you want to actually hear the voice of your own unconscious. Turning your phone off for 15 or 20 minutes a day, sitting or walking with no external stimulation at all, will noticeably increase your access to your own inner voice over time. Another useful practice is simply observing your own shifts in persona throughout an ordinary day. Notice how your tone of voice, your body language, your choice of words changes as you move between different people and different settings. Observe the difference between the version of you that speaks to your boss and the version of you that speaks to your closest friend. This should be done with curiosity rather than judgment. The goal is not to decide which version is right or wrong, but to notice how strongly or how weakly a consistent core self is felt underneath all these different personas. If that core feels very weak, that is, in Jung's framework, a sign of insufficient integration. When these methods, awareness, journaling, active imagination, dream analysis, and shadow work, are practiced together over time, the distance between the persona and the authentic self begins to shrink. This does not mean the persona disappears. You will still behave professionally at work. You will still follow appropriate social conventions in public settings. But the persona will no longer control you. You will use it as a conscious, chosen tool, and most importantly, you will retain access, beneath that tool, to your own real feelings and your own real needs. Now let's return to where we began. When someone asked how you were doing, what did you say? Maybe, even while listening to this, that exact question was asked of you yesterday or an hour ago, and you answered automatically with fine. There is no need to judge yourself for that. It is a natural part of being human, a natural part of being a social creature. The persona is not your enemy. It is your oldest, most loyal servant. But like any servant left without a master, without oversight, without limits, it can eventually take over the house and lock the actual owner outside, at the core of everything. Jung taught its one central idea. You are not merely the mask you present to the world. You are something older, something larger, something deeper than the mask itself, something that carries the mask rather than being defined by it. And your life's task, that sacred process Jung called individuation, is to recognize that mask, to learn to use it consciously, but never to identify with it so completely that you lose your own authentic voice underneath it. This is the modern, psychological translation of the ancient inscription at the Temple of Delphi, know thyself. Knowing yourself is not simply knowing which masks you wear. It is recognizing the unchanging core that exists before all of those masks and after all of them. The Delphic oracle spoke that phrase thousands of years ago, but Jung translated it into the language of science, of clinical practice, of therapy, and in doing so, handed us a concrete map for actually walking that path. Think for a moment about how many of history's most remembered, Figures are remembered precisely because they were able to make this distinction. Socrates, faced with social pressure and political persecution, remained loyal to his own inner voice, to his own philosophical inquiry, and that loyalty cost him his life, while also making him immortal. This is not, of course, the scale of heroism most of us need to reach in our own daily lives. But Socrates reminds us that the distinction between persona and authentic self has been, throughout human history, the source of some of humanity's most valuable and most enduring contributions. Your own life, on its own scale, can hold a version of that same heroism. It does not require a grand, sweeping revolution. It only requires, moment by moment, in small everyday instances, the courage to stand a little closer to your own real voice. Maybe that means telling a friend what you actually feel. Maybe that means writing a page at the end of the day with no filter at all. Maybe it simply means looking at your own face in the mirror, asking how you really are, and waiting for the true answer. Where does this journey lead? Jung insisted that the process of individuation has no final destination, no finish line. It is a lifelong process, returning again and again with every new stage of life, every new crisis. But as a person continues walking this path, they gradually feel less fragmented, less alienated from themselves, and increasingly whole. Jung called this the self, capitalized, the dynamic principle of wholeness, sitting at the center of the entire psychic structure, holding together ego and unconscious, persona and shadow, the known and the unknown. Reaching this self is, in psychological terms, the equivalent of what spiritual traditions call enlightenment, awakening, liberation. Satori in Buddhism, grace in Christianity, Fana in Sufism, each tradition, in its own language, describes a person moving beyond their small, limited, persona-bound ego into contact with a larger, more encompassing reality. Jung did not dismiss these religious experiences. He regarded them as concrete expressions of the deepest and most universal search within the human psyche. Two can contribute to this larger journey. In small daily moments, every honest answer you give to how are you, every suppressed feeling you notice, every journal page you write, every dream you remember, all of these are small but indispensable pieces of this larger mosaic. Over time, these small pieces accumulate, and one day, perhaps when you least expect it, you find yourself feeling more at peace, more whole, more real. The poet Rainer Maria Rilke once advised a young writer to be patient toward all that is unsolved in his heart and to try to love the questions themselves. That advice applies directly to this journey between persona and authentic self. Perhaps today you will not know the true answer. Perhaps your own inner world still feels blurry, still feels uncertain. That is entirely normal. What matters is patience with that uncertainty and moving day by day in small steps toward gradually clearing the fog. Remember, the persona exists to protect you. It is not your enemy, but it should never be allowed to become your master either. Perhaps you have grown, perhaps you have changed, and perhaps some part of that old mask no longer fits who you have become. This does not mean you need to discard it entirely. It only means you may need to reshape it so that it fits the larger, more expanded person you have grown into. The next time someone asks how you are, pause, take a single breath, and ask yourself honestly, how am I really doing? The answer might surprise you. And in that exact moment of surprise, your real journey of individuation begins.